Get her away from that wreck." That's what the soldier yelled when he saw a barefoot little girl approach a burned piano in the middle of a war zone. But what happened next stunned the entire world. She didn't flinch. She sat, and when her fingers touched those scorched keys, she played a song that silenced the battlefield and awakened a global movement. This is the unforgettable true story of Amira, the orphan who never spoke, but whose music broke through rubble, borders, and hearts. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now, let's get back to the story. Why is she sitting there? Get her away from that wreck, now! The soldier's voice cracked like a rifle through the smoky air, echoing across the ruins of what was once a playground. His boots pounded against the rubble as he sprinted toward the girl, weaving past crumbled walls and twisted rebar, waving his arms in panic. But the little girl didn't flinch. She sat motionless on the broken bench of the burned piano, her feet too short to reach the floor, her palms resting lightly on soot-smeared ivory. Her dress, once white, was the color of ash. Her fingers, thin and trembling, hovered above the keys like a ghost poised between worlds. Another soldier grabbed his arm. Wait, look." They froze. The air hung heavy with smoke and sorrow. Behind her, the skeletal remains of a bombed-out school still smoldered. The sun cast an eerie glow through the cracks in the walls, illuminating the child in a shaft of golden light. She looked like an angel fallen into the apocalypse. And then she pressed a key. It was cracked, burned, and barely audible. But the sound it made, the fragile note that echoed through the ruins, felt like a whisper from the soul of the city. People began to gather. Soldiers, aid workers, journalists, locals too numb to cry, too tired to run. They stood in a rough circle, silent and uncertain, drawn not by force but by something deeper, something sacred. She played another note, then another, a hesitant chord, dissonant at first, but then something changed. From the scorched remains of the piano came the beginnings of a melody. A melody no one had heard in weeks, maybe months. Not since the bombs fell, not since the sky turned to fire and the earth to dust, not since children stopped laughing and mothers stopped singing lullabies. The music was broken, but beautiful, wounded, but alive. And so was she. Just 48 hours earlier, that same corner of the city had been a battlefield. Tanks rolled through the streets. Artillery lit up the night. Whole neighborhoods were reduced to smoldering skeletons of concrete and steel. Emergency broadcasts blared over radios that quickly fell silent. And in the chaos, names vanished. Records disappeared. Children became shadows. No one remembered how she got there. No one even knew her name yet. But as she played, eyes closed, head tilted toward the sky like she was trying to remember something long forgotten, the war itself seemed to pause. The camera crew, who had been filming a report on humanitarian aid, turned their lenses silently toward her. One of them, a weathered man named Raphael, who hadn't cried in 20 years, lowered his rig and just watched. Watched the way her fingers moved despite the blood and grime. Watched how she didn't wipe the soot from her eyes. Watched the way she played like someone who knew what grief really sounded like. She's playing Chopin, someone whispered. An older woman, clutching a torn shawl around her shoulders, nodded slowly. Nocturne in E minor, I used to play that too. But this was not the nocturne as they knew it. This was reborn. The girl played not just with notes, but with memories. Each phrase bent under the weight of sorrow, each pause more powerful than any crescendo. The piano cried with her, moaned with her, sang with her. Even the fire-blackened keys, many of them broken or silent, seemed to obey her touch. Where sound failed, the rhythm spoke, and somehow, impossibly, the song continued. A medic nearby lowered his defibrillator and blinked. "We haven't heard music in this city since." "I know," whispered a translator. "And that piano, it shouldn't even work. It shouldn't." The piano had been outside for weeks, burned, weathered, warped, stripped of polish. Its strings had been partially melted, its wood blistered and cracked. It had been sitting like a monument to death in the schoolyard, untouched until now. Someone tried to speak to the girl. She didn't respond. A soldier kneeled beside her, careful not to touch. "What's your name, sweetheart?" No answer, only the music. "What's she doing here alone?" someone asked. She's too young to be wandering through the city like this. Where's her family? The silence that followed was heavier than the crumbling buildings around them. She's probably one of the basement children, said the old woman again. Some of the orphans lived under the school. The bomb hit a week ago. We thought they were all gone. She turned away, wiping her eyes. Guess not. The girl played on, oblivious to the growing crowd. The dust swirled gently around her feet. A white cloth fluttered from a shattered window above, like a flag of surrender, and still she played. The city, what was left of it, held its breath. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, but it sounded faint, like it too knew better than to break the spell. Raphael lifted his camera again. Keep rolling, he whispered to his crew. Don't stop, the world needs to see this. And they did. What started as a local report would, within 24 hours, become the most shared video in the world. A little girl in a dust-covered dress, a destroyed piano, and a piece of music that defied war. But in this moment, she was just a girl with nothing left. No shoes, no name, no voice, only the song. Her arms trembled with each note. Not from fear, but from the weight of carrying something too big for her tiny body. Something sacred, something sorrowful, something the world had almost forgotten. Hope. Raw, unfiltered, aching hope. Then, without warning, she stopped. The final note hung in the air, incomplete. Her hands fell into her lap, her head bowed. The crowd didn't move, they didn't breathe. Seconds passed like hours, and then she turned. Just slightly, just enough. Her eyes met Raphael's camera lens, and in that gaze, wide, dark, and filled with more pain than any child should bear, there was a question. Did they hear me? The soldier who first shouted now stood frozen, his rifle forgotten. I didn't mean to yell, he murmured. I thought she was just sitting on a bomb. Someone in the back of the crowd whispered, she was. And still, she played. Who is she? The question danced through the crowd like the smoke coiling in the air. Everyone wanted to ask it, but no one dared to say it too loud, as if naming her would break the fragile spell she had woven. But no one knew. Not the medics, not the soldiers, not even the relief workers who had spent the last 3 months tracking every orphan, every survivor. She had simply appeared, like a ghost summoned by grief, sitting at a piano that should have been dust and silence. And yet, she played like she remembered every note from a life she had no right to still carry. Her name was Amira. She had been born under the crackling lull of war sirens and raised on the edge of despair. Her parents, both schoolteachers, were the kind of people who planted sunflower seeds in sidewalk cracks and taught poetry while artillery rolled through the hills. They taught Amira 3 languages, 2 lullabies, and 1 piano piece. The nocturne. Back then, the school where her parents taught had 1 piano in the music room, old, out of tune, ivory yellowed by time. But it was enough. That was where Amira first touched music. She was 4 years old. Too small to reach the pedals, too curious not to try. Her mother would sit beside her after school while her father swept the halls. The war, even then, was circling like a hawk, but inside the music room, it couldn't reach them. Not yet. Play the part that sounds like rain, her mother would whisper, guiding her fingers. Let it fall, slow and soft. I want to play the part that sounds like thunder. Amira giggled once, and so she learned both. By the time she turned 6, Amira could play the entire nocturne in E minor by memory, not with precision, but with feeling. With that fragile, trembling emotion only children who've seen too much can carry in their hands. But then came the night. It was the sound no one ever forgot, the whistle-crack thunder of an incoming strike. The bomb landed 2 blocks from their apartment. Windows shattered, walls split, and the city swallowed itself in flame. Amira's parents didn't survive the second blast. She did. By luck or fate, or the cruelty of chance, she crawled out from under the rubble with a bleeding arm and ash in her lungs. That night, she said her last words. Since then, silence had been her language. She ended up beneath the same school her parents once taught at, the one that stood, or rather leaned, like a crippled giant on the edge of town. Aid groups had converted its basement into a temporary shelter for orphans. No beds, just mats. No toys, just whispers. No laughter. Amira didn't speak, but she drew. On old cardboard boxes and soot-smudged notebooks, she sketched pianos, dozens of them. Always the same, burned, broken, yet still standing. One of the volunteers, a young woman named Zoya, took notice. She won't talk, Zoya said to the head medic. But she dreams in music. I can see it. The medic shrugged. What can we do? There are hundreds like her. We can't even keep clean water. Still, Zoya tried. She found a piece of charcoal and handed it to Amira one evening. Do you know this? She asked, sketching a few notes on torn paper. Amira blinked, then took the charcoal and added the rest of the measure. It was the nocturne. Zoya stared. Where did you learn this? But Amira only turned the paper over and began drawing a scorched piano, surrounded by fireflies. The school was bombed 2 nights later. No warning, no evacuation. They hit at dawn, an hour most believed sacred. But in war, there is no sacred time, only survival. Rescue teams came too late. Most of the children were gone. But Zoya survived, and so somehow did Amira. They found her curled beside the piano in the upper hall, burned, blackened, but miraculously intact. She was unconscious, one arm tucked protectively around the bench like it was her last tether to the world. Zoya screamed when she saw her. Not because of the blood, but because of the way Amira's fingers were still curled in the shape of a cord. As if she'd played through the fire. After that, Amira vanished. No one could say where she went. Not the Red Cross, not the local military. It was as if she melted into the rubble, slipped between the cracks of the city's grief. A ghost child, a silent hymn left behind in a place where lullabies had no home. Until that day, the day of the video. Where did she come from? One of the younger soldiers muttered, watching the playback. The footage had already begun spreading, first among the troops, then through the journalists embedded with them. In the clip, Amira looked like something out of a myth. The piano sat crooked, its legs uneven from the blast. The top was scorched black, the keys stained with ash and rain. But it stood, and so did she. No one understood why she had come back there, days after the second attack. But the piano, maybe it was calling her, or maybe she had nothing left to answer to but that melody. Across the sea, in a cafe in Berlin, an elderly music professor watched the clip with tears rolling silently down his cheeks. Listen to her timing, he whispered to no one. She's not playing it correctly, but she's playing it truthfully. In a university dorm in Brazil, a pianist stopped mid-rehearsal to rewatch the video. She's pressing through pain, he murmured. It's like she's using the piano to remember how to breathe. In Los Angeles, a composer rewrote his score for an entire documentary after seeing her play for just 60 seconds. And in the ruins of her city, Amira sat quietly, unaware of the millions who now knew her face, unaware that the world had begun to mourn with her. Back in the city, Zoya watched the video in stunned silence. Her hands shook as she whispered, "That's her. That's Amira. My God, she's alive." But by the time she reached the ruins, Amira was gone again. Only the scorched piano remained, now surrounded by candles, letters, flowers, and one delicate paper sketch, a drawing of a music room with 2 adults and a child, seated at the bench. The silence after a bombing is different. It isn't quiet, it aches. It hangs in the air like a held breath that never comes. And in that aching silence, Amira had found a voice, not through words, but through a melody born from memory and scar tissue. She didn't need to speak. Her song had already said everything. She's not lost. She's remembering the only thing they couldn't take from her. Zoya's voice trembled as she stared at the still frame on the news site. Amira, lit by sunlight through a smoke-filled sky, seated at the charred remains of the school's old piano. The world called her the phantom pianist. But Zoya knew better. That was Amira. The girl who never spoke. The girl who never cried. The girl who once pressed charcoal to paper and drew a melody when words failed. Now the world was listening. The video spread like wildfire, first across the war zone's border, then beyond nations, across languages. One journalist uploaded it to a private server expecting a few views. Within hours, millions had watched. On screens in New York cafes and Tokyo train stations, in classrooms in Paris, on tablets in refugee camps where children crowded together, pointing and whispering in wonder. A silent girl, a burned piano, and a sound that cut through rubble like sunlight breaking through winter. The footage was unedited, no commentary, no music overlay, just Amira, barefoot, ash-smudged, fingers trembling, and the nocturne. The pianist Lang Lang tweeted a single word, haunting. Yo-Yo Ma shared the video with the caption, "Some souls are born already carrying the weight of 1,000 years." And Alicia Keys, watching the clip during a studio break, covered her mouth and whispered, This little girl just told the whole world what pain sounds like, and still made it beautiful. In cities far from war, people flooded forums asking, "Who is she? Where is this? How can I help?" But no one had answers. Aid workers in the region scrambled. Screenshots circulated, maps were marked. Even the military, moved by the outcry, began searching. But Amira was nowhere to be found. She had vanished, again. Zoya sat in a relief tent, phone clenched in her palm, replaying the moment Amira paused between chords. Eyes closed, brow furrowed, and pressed forward with hands that shouldn't have been able to remember such delicate precision. "She hasn't spoken since her parents died," Zoya said aloud, her voice thick with grief. "But she remembers. She remembers through the music. That piano? It should have been gone. Burned, blown apart, forgotten. But it had survived. Barely. The music room had collapsed in the second wave of shelling, but somehow the instrument hadn't been consumed by fire. Scorched, yes, cracked, blackened, but still standing, like a monument to something the war couldn't quite kill. Maybe Amira returned not to play on it, but with it. Two survivors sharing the same song. Meanwhile, across oceans, something unexpected began to unfold. Symphonies played tribute. A chamber group in Vienna performed the Nocturne by candlelight, dedicating it to the girl who played for the dead. A youth orchestra in Chicago rewrote their final concert program to include only works inspired by the child's melody. Art students painted her. Images of Amira circulated, portraits of a barefoot girl framed in smoke and music, always quiet, always alone. In one mural in Spain, she was depicted as a winged child seated on a flaming piano, with burned sheet music floating behind her like feathers. Activists rose, protesters in London held signs, "Let her play in peace." A university in Toronto launched a scholarship in her name for displaced children gifted in the arts, and the hashtag for Amira began trending worldwide. But amid all this, Amira remained invisible. She didn't know the world had seen her. She didn't know the world had wept for her. That strangers were searching. That children lit candles beside their toy keyboards in her honor. That someone had called her the soul of the war zone. No, she knew only the silence. The silence after you wake up and no one is left. The silence of rain dripping through a roofless room. The silence of knowing that everything you love has been reduced to smoke. But inside that silence, she had found one sound she could still hold. The song her mother taught her. In a broken village 20 kilometers away, an old man claimed to have seen her. She sat near the well, he told a journalist. Didn't say a word. Had something wrapped in cloth, might have been music sheets, maybe charcoal. I asked where she came from. She just hummed, a little tune. He whistled the melody. It was the Nocturne. She left before morning, he added, gone like a breeze. Back in the capital, a man named Lucien, a famous conductor and child of war himself, watched the video on repeat. He called a press conference. This girl, he said to the sea of microphones, reminded the world what true art is. Not fame, not applause, but the soul speaking through scars. He paused, then raised a printed still from the video. If you find her, tell her this. There's a stage waiting, a real one. With lights and peace and warmth, no bombs, no fear, just music. Even the United Nations responded. In a rare show of unity, ambassadors stood to honor her. A grainy clip of her playing was shown on screens behind them as the Secretary General delivered an unprecedented statement. In an age of cruelty, one child reminded us of compassion. In a world of division, she spoke a universal language. We are listening. But Amira didn't hear that. She was somewhere else, wandering fields that had once been gardens, sketching on the backs of ration slips, finding moments of music in wind and water and footsteps. Still silent, still remembering. Each night, she played in her mind, pressing keys only she could see. She had no piano anymore, but her hands remembered the shape of the sound. Her bones remembered the rhythm. When the world forgot everything, Amira remembered the music, and the music remembered her. You're going to get yourself killed, little one. The voice came from behind her, hushed and tired. A soldier, barely more than a boy himself, stood beneath the scorched frame of a bus stop, watching Amira as she stepped through the broken gate of her old school. The ash clung to her bare feet. The sky overhead hung in that terrible quiet that came after an air raid, cloudless, too blue, like it had forgotten what grief looked like. But Amira didn't stop. She didn't answer. She just walked. A head like a ghost from another lifetime, the burned piano waited, its splintered bench twisted, one of the front legs snapped, the lid half melted. Strings jutted like veins from an open wound. It looked less like an instrument and more like the wreckage of something holy. And still, it called to her. The last time she'd played it, her mother was still alive. The sun had been soft that day, the windows unbroken. Her tiny fingers had trembled with excitement, not from cold. Her mother had laughed when she played the wrong chord, gently correcting her posture, brushing her hair from her eyes. Now, Amira approached in silence. The music room was gone. The walls had crumbled, leaving only jagged corners of brick. But the piano stood in defiance, just as she did, and though the wind howled softly through the ruins, she sat and placed her hands, still bandaged, still raw, on the battered keys. The moment her fingers touched them, time folded, not backwards, inwards, as if the music she carried inside had finally found a way out again. The first sound was brittle, a hollow sea that warbled with rust and cracked wood. It echoed off the stone in silence like a breath held too long. Then came another note, then a chord, then a phrase that shouldn't have been possible, not on this skeleton of an instrument. But Amira didn't flinch. She played through the flaws, through the gaps, through the burned keys that wouldn't speak. She played around the brokenness, with the brokenness, like a dancer adjusting steps for a shattered floor. And that's when the soldier stopped walking. That's when the aid worker lowered her radio. That's when the film crew across the street, covering rubble distribution, turned, one by one, toward the sound that shouldn't have been there. Music, real music. Not a radio, not a recording, but something alive, something fragile and aching and utterly impossible in that place at that hour. It was like a whisper through the ruins, a promise whispered in a child's tongue, one note, then another, and then, suddenly, a melody. Chopin's Nocturne in E minor, reborn. The camera operator Raphael almost dropped his lens when he saw her. She was just a silhouette at first, haloed in gold light filtered through dust and flame-scorched air. But when the camera zoomed in, the image became clear. A girl, barefoot, face streaked with soot, hair matted, sitting straight-backed at a piano that should have crumbled, and playing like the world had never fallen apart. Something about her posture struck Raphael. The way she leaned, not like she was performing but like she was listening. As if the song were already there, hanging in the ruins, and she was just catching it, like a net cast into the sea of silence. Every sound she made carried more than notes. It carried names, names of children buried beneath playgrounds, names of mothers who never made it to the shelter, names of lullabies that had turned to screams. But Amira didn't scream. She played. Her left hand brushed across the lower keys, coaxing a hesitant harmony. Her right danced, not with grace, but with will. Her fingers were blistered, some wrapped in torn gauze, but still they moved with the patience of someone rebuilding a house brick by brick. Each note was an act of resurrection. Each pause, a prayer. People emerged from doorways and alleys, drawn like moths to a fire they didn't understand. Some thought it was a recording. Others thought they were hallucinating. But when they saw her, saw the movement, saw the rawness, they knew. A hush settled, the kind of hush reserved for funerals, for births, for those moments when something greater than fear enters the room. No one dared speak, not even the children. Amira's fingers reached the central passage, the piece's most delicate refrain. The piano groaned beneath her. The keys were hot from the sun. The wood under her thighs threatened to splinter. But she didn't stop. She had one more phrase to give. A rising melody that shimmered like a memory she hadn't lived fully, but remembered anyway. And then, the final note. She pressed it, not with power, but with surrender. A whisper of a tone, a breath of sound, and as it faded into the heavy air, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of grief, full of awe, full of something no one there could explain, but everyone felt. She opened her eyes slowly and saw them, people, soldiers, survivors, faces streaked with tears and ash, all staring. A baby cried in the distance, a woman dropped to her knees, and then applause, not loud, not frenzied, but trembling, raw, grateful. Amira didn't smile, but she nodded, once, then stepped down from the bench, leaving a smudge of ash where her dress had touched it. The camera rolled silently. Raphael whispered, "That wasn't a performance, that was a funeral, and a resurrection." Later that night, Back in the makeshift press tent, Raphael uploaded the clip. He didn't add a caption. No music, no filters, just the raw footage. He stared at the title bar for a long time before typing, "Fingers of fire on broken ivory, a child plays through the ashes." Then he hit upload. By dawn, the world had changed. Continue. No headings, ChatGPT said. The internet does not always agree on what matters. But this time, it did. Within 8 hours, the video had crossed every ocean, spoken every language, and ignited something long buried in a world dulled by violence. It began humbly, a few reposts, whispered threads on niche forums. But by morning, it surged. 12 million views before sunrise. News anchors tried to narrate it, but their words stumbled after the first frame. A child, a piano, in the middle of. They couldn't finish. Some simply let the video roll without commentary, as if any voice layered over hers would desecrate the purity of it. In New York, rush hour traffic froze as a massive digital billboard played the moment she closed her eyes. In Berlin, commuters stood still in a metro station, eyes locked on their phones, lips parted in reverence. In Nairobi, a school paused mid-lesson. A teacher pressed pause on the chaos of education and held up her phone. "Listen," she whispered to her class. "This is what courage sounds like." It didn't matter that the piano was half destroyed. It didn't matter that half the keys didn't work. She had made them work. She had made the silence submit. Donations began to pour in, not to an organization but to find her, to thank her, to protect her. But no one could. She had vanished again. The girl who pulled music from fire had left no footprints. Theories spun wild. Was she a refugee who returned? A child of diplomats? A figment of wartime legend? Some claimed it was CGI. Others said no, she was real, she was divine, she was a spirit. But someone had recognized her. Zoya stared at the screen, eyes wide, heart pounding. The way Amira's shoulders curled when she played, the way she sat, feet tucked under the bench, one elbow slightly higher, it was her. "I know those hands," she whispered. "I wrapped them after the first bombing." She sent every still frame to aid stations, UN contacts, anyone who would listen. But the chaos of war doesn't care about fame. In the world beyond the screen, the city was still broken. Aid convoys were still delayed. Children still slept with their backs to cracked walls. And somewhere among them, Amira moved like a shadow. But something else had begun to move with her. The sound of her music. Echoes that clung to people's memory. The haunting cadence of her nocturne began appearing in unexpected places. A violinist in Prague stood on a rooftop and played it by ear, with birds circling overhead. A cellist in Seoul mimicked the dissonant phrasing she used, imperfect and raw. A blind pianist in South Africa replicated her exact broken tempo and wept when he hit the cracked notes part, because it still sounded like truth. Art students in London sketched her silhouette. One young artist painted her as a phoenix with keys for feathers, rising from a pile of bombed-out bricks. Everywhere her music lived, not in perfection, but in persistence. And then the tributes came. A stage in Vienna held a single concert, no applause, no introductions, just the nocturne, played by children from conflict zones. One by one, they took turns. No matter their skill, each child sat where she sat, played how she played, barefoot. Silent, reverent, no speeches, no curtain call, only silence after the final note. That night, the conductor turned to the crowd, tears on his cheeks. "That little girl did not just play music," he said. "She forced the world to listen." In Paris, the Louvre unveiled a temporary installation. A steel recreation of a half-melted piano. Burned sheet music scattered across the floor, each page bearing a single word written in ash. She remembered. In Chicago, a street mural bloomed overnight, Amira with closed eyes surrounded by children holding instruments made of rubble. Someone lit candles beneath it. Someone else left a toy keyboard. And in every place where someone had given up on hope, she quietly returned. In sound, in memory, in spirit. But what no one knew, even as they searched for her, even as they posted theories and tributes and offered rewards, was that Amira had seen the video. She'd seen it from a cracked smartphone held out by a kind older woman in a refugee camp near the mountains. She'd watched herself, covered in soot, hands trembling, sit at the ruined piano. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply watched. And when the video ended, and the old woman whispered, "Was that you?" Amira did something she hadn't done in a year. She nodded. The woman's hands flew to her mouth, But Amira was already walking toward the edge of the camp, toward a clearing where no one went during the day. Where silence grew thick and leaves fell without notice. She carried a blanket and a notebook and a single tattered sketch. The piano. She sat under a tree, opened the notebook, and began drawing again. Not with charcoal this time, but with a blue pen someone had given her. She drew keys, notes, a girl at peace. And then slowly she began to hum. It was barely audible, a breath, a ghost of a sound, but it was music. She hadn't spoken, not yet. But the song had found her again, and the world, unknowing, aching, kept searching, kept listening, waiting for the day the burned piano would sing once more. No headings, ChatGPT said. The wind moved softly through the camp that night, lifting the edges of canvas tents and rustling dry leaves that had fallen onto the cracked earth. Lanterns flickered, casting pale halos over the ground, and distant coughs echoed in the background like a broken chorus of survival. But in a small corner by the eastern fence, far from the sound of weeping or radio static, a different sound was rising. A rhythm, fragile, hummed, almost not there at all. Amira sat cross-legged, her back to the world, the old notebook balanced on her knees. The sketch she had drawn of the burned piano, the audience of ghosts, and the silence holding everything together, was now filled in with small music notations. They weren't written with rules, they were drawn like dreams. Some notes floated in the margins, some curled around the girl's shadow she'd drawn at the keys. Others spilled off the page entirely. She had always remembered sound better than language. The war had taken her words, but it hadn't taken that. She pressed the tip of the pen against her palm, not to hurt herself, but to feel something solid, something sharp and real. Her eyes drifted toward the hills in the distance. Somewhere beyond them was the school. The ruins, the piano. She wondered if it was still standing, or if someone had removed it, taken it to a museum maybe, or let it rot in the same silence that once swallowed her. She didn't know, she didn't want to. That piano had already served its purpose. It had carried her grief when she was too young to name it, and now the world had heard. That was enough. She lay back on the earth and closed her eyes. In her mind, she played again. But this time she wasn't alone. In her imagination, dozens of children stood beside her, each one with their own instrument. Broken drums, paper flutes, bows without strings. They weren't perfect, but they were enough. Enough to shape a song that remembered the people the war had forgotten. And at the center of them all, the piano. Still blackened, still cracked, but shining in moonlight as if it had been waiting all along. Amira breathed in and began to hum the new melody. It was something different now. Not Chopin, not memory. This was hers. It started low, a steady repetition like footsteps, then a lift, almost like a question. Then it dipped, gentle, soft, as though resting in someone's arms. The tune carried no lyrics, but it carried a story. A girl walks through ash. A girl plays where no one plays. A girl disappears into silence. But her music never leaves. Inside the refugee camp, a woman paused as she passed by. She listened, tilted her head. "Is that her again?" she whispered. Another nodded. "She hasn't spoken, but she's been singing at night, quiet, like she's sharing a secret." Some began to visit the spot during the evenings, not to interrupt, only to sit nearby. They brought what they had, a cracked harmonica, a small wooden spoon, 2 plastic bottles to tap against stone. Together they began making sounds that didn't try to be beautiful. They just tried to be true. A boy with one leg used his crutch to keep time. A girl with no family danced barefoot in circles. Even an old man, too tired to talk most days, whistled one phrase and smiled for the first time in months. It was music born from ruins, and it spread. Someone recorded it, quietly from the back of the camp. Within days, the audio traveled. It had no name, just a clip, Camp 42 evening, unknown composer. But the world recognized the melody. It wasn't a copy of Amira's nocturne performance. It wasn't classical, it wasn't polished, but it held the same ache, the same truth. Music historians debated its origin. Critics called it the sound of survival. A few skeptics dismissed it as coincidence, but people didn't care. They felt it. More orchestras began performing her melody, building it out, layering it with violins, with children's choirs, with cello harmonies that wrapped around each other like arms. They didn't know what to name it, so they named it after her. The Amira movement. In its first week, it played in over 60 countries. In its second, It was submitted to the UN as a global anthem for displaced children. Still, Amira didn't know. She didn't have a phone. She didn't have a home. But she had that notebook, now half full of sketches and scattered notations. And more importantly, she had her voice. At night, she sang not for crowds or cameras, but for the ghosts. For her mother's soft humming in the kitchen. For her father tapping rhythm into the floorboards. For the children who slept in basements and never woke. She sang because they couldn't, and somehow the world heard. One afternoon, as the sky darkened and wind chased sand across the edge of the camp, a stranger arrived. He wasn't dressed like the others. No fatigues, no medical vest, just a dark blue coat and a violin case in hand. He didn't speak at first, only listened. Amira sat by the same tree, eyes on the hills. The man stepped forward, slowly, carefully, as if afraid to startle a deer. "I heard your song," he said gently. Amira didn't turn. "I didn't change it. I only followed it, like a trail of lanterns." Still, silence. Then, finally, she looked. Their eyes met, and for the first time she saw someone who wasn't trying to save her, only someone who understood. He opened the violin case. "I don't know if you're ready," he said, "but when you want to, we can play it together." She stared. Then ever so faintly, she nodded. And in that moment, without fanfare or applause, Amira picked up a stick beside her, tapped it twice against the earth, and began to hum. The man lifted his violin. No tuning, no warm-up, no sheet music. He simply closed his eyes and followed her lead, letting the first notes flow not from expertise, but from reverence. His bow barely kissed the strings, rising and falling in time with the quiet tremble of her voice. It wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, but it was alive. Their duet, if it could be called that, was unlike anything he had ever played. It wasn't a composition, it was a conversation. Her hums were questions. His violin, answers. Her silences, pauses of pain. His phrasing, soft hands catching her when memory slipped beneath the surface. The camp began to still. Those nearby stopped what they were doing. Buckets remained unfilled at the well. A mother paused mid-sentence with a nurse. A child dropped their toy and turned toward the sound. No one moved, no one whispered, not out of fear, but because something sacred had entered the air again. Music made without permission, without politics, without polish. Amira opened her notebook and set it between them on the ground. Her drawings of broken keys, of falling notes, of children dancing barefoot in rubble, lay across the page like a map. She placed her hand on one of the sketches, a piano, drawn crooked, flames curling up its legs, but music still rising from its open lid. The man saw it. He nodded. They kept playing, and the sun began to set behind them, casting long, golden shadows over the camp. For the first time in a long while, the wind blew and didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a breath, one the earth itself had been holding back. Later, someone recorded it from a distance. Again, no one asked for names. No one needed them. The clip would circle the globe in the coming days. A girl with ash in her hair and light in her hands, sitting cross-legged beside a man with a battered violin, two voices meeting in the dust. One of the top comments beneath the video would simply read, "She never needed an audience, she just needed someone to play with." That night, as the lanterns were lit and families prepared what little food they had, Amira sat alone again under the tree. The violinist had gone, promising to return. He left behind a gift. A small keyboard, the size of a shoebox, powered by a solar panel. It wasn't much. Some of the keys stuck, some were off-key. But she didn't care. She ran her fingers over it, as if touching a friend. And then, she played. Not the nocturne this time. Something new, something gentle. A lullaby for the lost. She didn't notice that children had begun to gather nearby, nor that two women stood in silence, arms around each other, swaying softly to the rhythm. She didn't see the boy scribbling the notes onto the back of a ration box, or the old man who wept quietly behind his scarf. All she knew was the sound of belonging returning piece by piece. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, but no one moved. No one wanted to miss it. The moment when a war-torn world remembered what healing sounded like. And a little girl who had played through fire reminded them all, again, that even the most broken things can sing. The next morning arrived in soft grays, the sun hidden behind a gauze of clouds. Dew clung to the canvas tents and pooled along the edges of shattered pavement, but there was warmth beneath it, an almost imperceptible hum that seemed to linger in the air as if the night's music had not ended, only quieted. Amira rose early. She walked barefoot across the cool ground, her tiny keyboard cradled in both hands, wrapped gently in the same cloth that had once held the remnants of her drawings. She found her usual spot beneath the tree, now visibly worn where she had sat so many nights before, and knelt, placing the instrument before her like a sacred object. No one disturbed her. The people in the camp had learned. When she played, the world changed. Even the children had grown quiet in her presence. Not out of fear, but out of something deeper. Reverence. They didn't understand everything she played, but they understood what it meant. That someone small could carry something large, that even silence had a story, and Amira had become its author. She began to play again. This time, not with the raw emotion of someone purging pain, but with a new gentleness. A kind of invitation. The notes were simpler, spaced farther apart, yet no less profound. There was lightness in them now, a whisper of curiosity, of newness, of something beginning. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was close. A kind of reaching, a kind of hope. Others joined her without words. A boy brought a rusted tin can and tapped rhythm against it with his spoon. A girl used her voice, humming an uncertain harmony. The old man with the scarf returned and brought with him a battered accordion missing 3 keys. He played anyway, laughing at every wrong note, because in that moment there were no wrong notes, only courage. Zoya arrived mid-morning, breathless from travel, eyes searching. She hadn't slept in 2 nights. She had followed the music clips, the shared posts, the rumors, and now she stood at the edge of the tree line, tears streaming before she'd even taken her first step closer. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Amira looked up and saw her, a pause in the melody. A silence heavy with recognition. Zoya took a slow step forward, hand pressed to her heart. She looked older than Amira remembered. The war had deepened the lines in her face, dulled the shine in her hair. But the warmth in her eyes, the same eyes that once offered her a crayon and asked, "Do you want to draw something?" had never changed. Amira stood, and for the first time in over a year, she moved toward someone with open arms. Zoya fell to her knees. The hug was quiet, no sobs, no gasps. Just 2 broken people finding in each other a piece of what they'd lost. Around them the music stopped, not out of interruption, but out of respect. Then, gently, Amira placed her keyboard into Zoya's lap, lifted her hands and began to guide her fingers, 1 note at a time. Zoya laughed through her tears. "I can't play," she said softly. Amira didn't answer. She just placed her own hands atop Zoya's and pressed down. A chord, simple, clumsy, but beautiful. Zoya looked at her. "You remembered everything." Amira nodded once, then finally opened her mouth. It was dry, hesitant. Her lips trembled. The whole world seemed to lean forward, and then quiet, hoarse, cracked, but unmistakable, she spoke. "Thank you for not forgetting me." The world broke in that moment, not into sorrow, but into stillness, into awe, into that sacred kind of silence that only comes after the impossible has happened. Zoya covered her mouth and wept openly. Children clapped with wide eyes and hopeful hearts, and the violinist, who had returned quietly and stood at a distance, lifted his bow and began to play again. Not to lead her, but to follow. Because now the voice that had been silent for so long had returned. Amira didn't need to play through pain anymore. Now she could play through peace. Word spread quickly through the camp. Some whispered, others ran, some simply sat and let the tears fall freely. The girl who had not spoken since the skies fell, the girl whose music had once echoed through ruins and broken hearts alike, had found her voice again. Not in a grand speech, not in the spotlight, just 3 soft words, trembling with life. "Thank you for not forgetting me." Those who heard them would never forget them. By afternoon, the camp was transformed. Not physically. Its walls were still patched tarps, its food rations still thin, but emotionally, spiritually, something had shifted. A heaviness had lifted. People smiled at one another in passing. Children ran without glancing nervously at the sky. Even the air felt different, as though the dust itself had softened in the presence of something sacred. Zoya sat beside Amira, their shoulders touching, their hands still resting on the keyboard between them. They hadn't said much after that moment. They didn't need to. There are some reunions that only music and memory can explain. The violinist had returned with others, musicians, poets, volunteers who had heard the recordings and followed the trail like breadcrumbs through grief. They arrived not with answers, but with instruments. Battered guitars, makeshift drums, a flute made of hollow piping. None of it matched. All of it mattered. A stage was built, not of wood or spotlight, but of crates and blankets, assembled near the tree where Amira had played night after night. Someone brought paint and scrawled a message on a nearby wall, crooked but bold. Where words fail, her music spoke. The gathering wasn't announced. It didn't need posters. It didn't need translation. As the sun began to lower, people arrived silently, sitting on crates, on the ground, standing if they had to. From the camp, from neighboring towns, even from cities far away. And Amira stood quietly at the center. Not because she had been asked, not because she wanted to be seen, but because the music was ready again. This time, she didn't sit at a piano. She stood, barefoot, the small keyboard slung over her neck with twine and tape. It was bruised and chipped, but it had carried her across silence. She pressed the first key. The sound rang out, not clean, not sharp, but real. A heartbeat more than a note, she sang. Not in any one language, not even in full words. It was sound, pure, trembling, full of breath and earth and longing. The crowd leaned in, breath held. Then, behind her, others joined in. The violinist, a young boy with a cracked djembe drum, an old woman who shook a tin can filled with beans. Together they created something that wasn't quite a concert and wasn't quite a vigil. It was something new. It was healing. And then came the part that no one could have expected. From the back of the crowd, a little girl stood up. She wore a dress 2 sizes too big, her hair braided in lopsided loops. She had a plastic recorder in her hand. She walked forward slowly and stood next to Amira. Amira turned. The two locked eyes, and without hesitation, Amira stepped aside. She offered her the space. The girl raised the recorder and blew a shaky note. Amira followed with harmony. Then another child stood, then a third. One by one, children emerged, instruments clutched in hands. Some toys, some real, some made with string and imagination. They surrounded her, not behind her, with her. No longer the silent girl at the broken piano. Now the leader of a chorus the world had tried to forget. They played, they laughed, they missed notes and stumbled and clapped off rhythm. But it didn't matter, because for the first time in far too long, they were alive. No longer just survivors, they were creators. Builders of something that could never be taken again. When the final note faded, there was no applause. Just a long, reverent silence. And then slowly, with awe, people began to stand. Not clapping, not cheering, saluting, not with hands, but with hearts. A child had brought back music to a place that had forgotten it ever existed. And in doing so, she reminded them all that even in a world that burns, even in cities reduced to smoke and sorrow, something can still rise from the ash. Something soft, something strong, something that sounds like a song. That night, as stars blinked gently into a sky that finally felt distant instead of dangerous, Amira sat alone beneath the tree once more. But this time, the silence didn't press in like a weight. It felt like a companion, a space between breaths. She watched as lanterns glowed across the camp, soft flickers of life in what had once been just survival. From the far edge of the field, the soft thud of makeshift drums echoed faintly, where a group of children had refused to stop playing. Someone was singing in a language she didn't know. Laughter rose, quick and unsure, like it was remembering how to exist again. Her keyboard sat in her lap. She didn't play it. She just held it, her fingers resting gently across the keys, as if grateful to it, as if it were a friend that had carried her across a river of silence. Behind her, Zoya approached, carrying a warm blanket. She said nothing, only draped it gently over Amira's shoulders and sat down beside her. They stayed like that for a while, watching the night, listening to the faraway melody of a people remembering themselves. Then, finally, Zoya spoke. "They're talking about you everywhere. The video, the music, the world saw you." Amira tilted her head slightly but didn't answer. "There are journalists who want to meet you. Musicians who want to play with you. Donors asking how to help. Orchestras offering to fly you to their cities." She hesitated, but I told them, "You're not a symbol. You're a child. You don't owe anyone your song." Amira's lips parted slightly, her eyes never leaving the stars. "I wanted them to hear," she said quietly. "Just once." Zoya turned to her. "And they did. They forgot us." Her voice cracked on the second word, not from weakness, but from the burden of truth. Zoya reached for her hand. Maybe, but not anymore. Amira looked down at her fingers, the ones that had coaxed broken keys into beauty, that had bled and blistered, that had never once let go of the music, even when she had no words. They remember now, Zoya added, not just because of what you played, but because of who you are. Amira was quiet for a long time. Then, without warning, she began to hum. Not a full song, just a small, slow tune, more breath than melody. Zoya closed her eyes. It was new. Nothing from Chopin or Bach or old lullabies, just something soft, simple, entirely hers. She hummed to the sky, to the memory of her parents, to the piano that survived the fire, to the children who had danced beside her, to the ghosts who no longer haunted but listened. And in that moment, the earth felt still, as if the war had paused, if only for a breath, to make room for a little girl and her song. Somewhere far away, someone would wake in the middle of the night and hear the tune in a dream. Somewhere else, someone would remember the video, watch it again, and feel tears they hadn't known they needed to cry. And somewhere in the future, long after the tents had folded and the camp dissolved into memory, someone would tell a child about a little girl who played a burned piano in a war zone and changed the world. Not by speaking loudly, but by singing softly. And the child would ask, was it real? And the answer would come, not from history books or headlines, but from the music still drifting in the air, carried by those who heard it once and never forgot. Yes, she was real, and she still is. The morning after the gathering, birds returned to the trees near the camp. No one had seen or heard them in weeks, not since the last round of explosions had emptied the skies. But now they chirped softly, cautiously, as if testing the air for danger. Amira noticed them first. She sat beside the tree, legs tucked beneath her, sketchbook balanced against her knees. She was drawing, not a piano this time, but wings. Large, sweeping, uneven wings rising from the shoulders of a child whose face looked like hers. Zoya watched her from a distance, smiling faintly. There was something different in the way Amira moved now, still quiet, still inward, but not closed. She wasn't hiding anymore, she was becoming. Throughout the camp, people spoke of her not with awe, but with affection. She had stopped being the girl in the video, stopped being the symbol the world projected their hope onto. Here, she was Amira, again. The girl who helped younger kids make music from spoons and cans. The girl who listened more than she talked, but never turned anyone away. Word had come from the capital that day. Officials wanted to meet her. News agencies, too. A delegation from an international conservatory had offered her a scholarship. Full ride, all expenses, a fresh start. Zoya had read the letter twice before saying anything. Amira had listened, then nodded once. Not yes, not no, just that she'd heard. They didn't speak about it again that night. Instead, Amira spent the evening with the children by the fire pit, helping a boy tune the strings of a makeshift guitar. It was made from scrap wood and fishing line, but he'd carved stars into the side. She helped him hold the chords properly. When he finally strummed something that resembled a melody, he laughed so hard he dropped the guitar. Amira laughed too. It was soft, breathy, more exhale than sound, but Zoya, standing nearby, froze when she heard it. It was the first time, the sound of joy. Not memory, not sorrow, just joy. Later, as the stars came out, Amira walked alone to the edge of the camp. The wind was rising. It smelled like pine and smoke, like something old leaving and something new arriving. She sat and looked out over the hills. Somewhere beyond them was the school, the ruins, the piano. She didn't need to return to it. It had done its work. It had carried her voice when she couldn't speak. It had survived the fire so she could survive the silence. Now she could move forward. She closed her eyes and began to hum a melody so quiet it sounded like it was stitched from breath. But it wasn't for anyone else. It was a song just for her. By the end of that week, the camp began to change in ways no one expected. It wasn't that food supplies suddenly improved or the water lines ran clearer or medical aid came more quickly. The tents were still thin, the nights still cold, and the outside world still loud and slow in its response. But something had shifted inside the people. There was music now, not always in melody, sometimes just in the way people moved, more gently, more deliberately, as if every act was part of a larger rhythm. Laughter rang more easily between tents, voices didn't lower in fear as often. Children played games again, their rules made up, their instruments imaginary. And at the center of it all, still quiet, still barefoot, was Amira. She had become something of a mystery to the newcomers, those who arrived days or weeks after the video had gone viral. Some recognized her instantly and froze in quiet reverence. Others didn't believe the girl in dusty clothes, humming under a tree with a half-broken keyboard, was the same child who had shattered the internet with her defiant grace. But it didn't matter. She had no interest in correcting them. She no longer needed anyone to believe she was special. She only needed them to listen. Each night, without fail, she returned to the tree. It had become her stage, her sanctuary, her chapel. The little keyboard rested on her lap like a sacred object, its battery carefully preserved with help from the solar panels Zoya had patched together. Her fingers danced across the worn keys, producing sounds that were sometimes too soft to catch unless you were sitting nearby, but always honest. One evening, she played something new. Not Chopin. Not the lullaby she'd written. Not the anthem the world had named after her. This was something different. Fragile, searching, unfinished. Zoya listened, brow furrowed, wondering what it was. The melody climbed high but never resolved. It circled around a single unresolved chord like it was afraid to land. It felt like a question. Like something Amira hadn't yet found the words to say. Afterward, Zoya asked her gently, "What were you playing?" Amira, still staring at the sky, replied softly, "I think it's the beginning." Zoya blinked. "The beginning of what?" Amira shrugged, her eyes distant but bright. "I don't know, but it doesn't feel like the end." The next morning, the letter came. It arrived on official paper, delivered by a translator who looked both nervous and honored. She unfolded it before them near the medical tent, reading it aloud with careful words and glances. The invitation came from a coalition of international symphonies, a global stage, Geneva, Berlin, New York, a performance, a tribute, a message of peace. But not for her alone. They wanted Amira to choose. Her melody had sparked a movement. Children from all over had begun recording their own versions. Some played with precision, others with pure feeling. A boy in Syria had built a violin from water pipes and played her lullaby from memory. A girl in Ukraine sang her tune with words she wrote herself. A school in Nigeria composed a choral version that had moved its audience to tears. Now the world wanted them all. The conductor's message was clear. This will not be a concert of experts. This will be a concert of survivors. Amira opened the door. Let her walk through it with those who followed. Zoya lowered the letter. Everyone turned to Amira. She didn't say anything right away. Instead, she reached into her small sketchbook, pulled out a folded page, and handed it to Zoya. It was a drawing. One she'd been working on in secret for days. A vast stage. An orchestra of children from every corner of the earth. Each one holding an instrument patched together with love and pain. And at the center, a girl, not standing in front, not alone, but among them. She had already said yes. The weeks that followed moved quickly. Visas were processed, transport secured, safe passage granted, instruments restored, tuned, borrowed, shipped, uniforms donated. But Amira asked for none of it to be extravagant. She made one request: no shoes. If they were to play as survivors, they must stand as they were when they found their song. Barefoot, honest, unhidden. The world hesitated, then agreed. When Amira stepped onto the stage in Geneva for the final rehearsal, the hall fell silent. Reporters lowered their cameras, producers forgot their cues. She wore a simple white dress hand-stitched by women in the camp. Her keyboard hung from a strap across her shoulder, repaired one final time, still chipped, still perfect. Children from 15 countries stood around her, barefoot, just like she asked. The conductor raised his hands. And for the first time, Amira began a song not from memory, but from the present. They played together. The stage held more than music. It held wounds and will and stories never spoken aloud. Some children stumbled, others froze for a moment. Amira never turned, never corrected. She simply played on. And when it ended, when the final note faded into the deepest silence, no one stood. They wept first. Only later did they rise. The ovation lasted 13 minutes. Amira never bowed. She just looked up at the lights above, as if seeing the sky through a roofless ruin, and smiled the smallest smile the world had ever known. They called it the Song of the Ashes. It would echo for decades. played in schools and films and state ceremonies and quiet hospitals, taught not just as music, but as memory. But for Amira, it was never about fame. The morning after the concert, she declined the interview requests. She asked for one thing: to return. Not to the rubble, not to the piano, not even to the camp, but to the place where music had become her voice, where a broken keyboard and a tree had taught her that silence was not a cage, but a cocoon. Zoya arranged everything. They traveled light, just the two of them, a notebook, a scarf, and a keyboard that had already lived 3 lifetimes. When they reached the tree again, it was still there. So were the children. So was the wind. Amira sat down. She played nothing. Not yet. Instead, she placed her hand on the earth, closed her eyes, listened, and in the quiet, she heard it again. Not the piano, not the war, but the sound of the world remembering itself. And for the first time in her life, Amira felt something she didn't have to draw or hum or whisper into the night. She felt peace, and this time, it sang for her. And so, in a world shattered by war, it wasn't generals or governments who brought healing, but a barefoot girl with ash in her hair and music in her heart. Amira never asked to be a symbol. She never spoke her pain. She simply played it, note by trembling note, until silence gave way to song and sorrow turned into something sacred. She reminded the world that even when everything burns, something beautiful can still survive the fire. Because sometimes, the loudest voice comes from a child who refuses to speak.